Camping had always been one of my favorite ways to get away from everything. The noise, the stress, the constant distractions of life. Out in the woods, with nothing but a tent, a fire, and the quiet sounds of nature, it was easier to breathe. My fiancée and I had been going on camping trips together for years, and over time we had built up a rhythm. Setting up camp, cooking, relaxing under the stars. We knew how to handle ourselves out there. Last summer, we planned a weekend trip to Arkansas, choosing a spot that wasn't too remote but still far enough from the main roads to feel isolated. The campground was spread out, with plenty of space between sites and thick woods separating them. It was the kind of place where you might hear someone in the distance but never see them, where the sounds of crackling fires and faint laughter disappeared into the trees before they ever reached your tent. We arrived in the late afternoon, setting up camp at a site near a small creek. It was perfect, flat ground, plenty of shade, and a good spot for our tent not too far from the fire pit. The air was warm but not unbearable, the humidity hanging low over the trees. The scent of pine and damp earth mixed with the smoke from other campsites, drifting through the air in lazy tendrils. By early evening, we had settled in. The fire was going, the grill was heating up, and we were starting to cook. I was flipping burgers while my fiancée poked at the fire, occasionally tossing in small sticks to keep the flame steady. The sun was sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The sound of cicadas had started to rise, their constant drone filling the air. Then we heard it, a voice, distant but loud, cut through the background noise, sharp, urgent. A man's voice yelling. At first, I thought it was just someone goofing around, maybe a group of campers getting a little too rowdy after a few beers. But then I caught the words. Help! I froze, burger still in hand. My fiancé's head snapped up, eyes narrowing in the direction of the voice. Came again, closer this time. Without thinking, I dropped what I was doing and ran. The sound had come from a few campsites over, just beyond the trees. My feet pounded against the dirt as I weaved through the brush, the undergrowth scraping against my legs. The smell of smoke and charred food faded, replaced by something sharper, metallic. Then I saw him, a man, standing near a picnic table, swaying slightly. His clothes were soaked in something dark, pooling at his feet in the dirt. For a split second, my brain refused to process it. Then I saw his leg. Blood poured from his ankle in thick, pulsing waves, pooling around his foot and seeping into his sock. It wasn't just a cut. It was gushing, spraying onto the ground in bright red streaks. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. My fiancée was right behind me, skidding to a stop as we took in the scene. I forced myself to move. Training from a first aid course years ago kicked in, apply pressure, elevate, stop the bleeding. My fiancée grabbed a towel from the man's table, pressing it hard against the wound, wrapping it as tightly as possible. Blood soaked through immediately. I turned and sprinted back to our campsite, nearly tripping over tree roots, my lungs burning. I grabbed my phone from the table, swiping at the screen with shaking hands. No service. I cursed, spinning in place. There was no time to wait for an ambulance, no way to even call for one. I ran back to the man, who was now sitting on the ground, his breath coming in ragged gasps. My fiancée had managed to slow the bleeding, but it wasn't enough. His foot twitched slightly, barely responding. I knew there was a hospital about 20 miles away, down winding back roads. A long drive in normal circumstances. Too long now. I made the decision before I could think too hard about it. I grabbed his truck keys from the picnic table, helped him to his feet as best as I could. He was heavy, leaning against me, his weight almost too much. We half-carried him to his truck, throwing open the passenger door. My fiancée climbed into the back seat, still holding pressure on his leg. I jumped behind the wheel, turned the key, and peeled out of the campsite, gravel kicking up behind us. The road was dark, winding, Nothing but my high beams cutting through the night. My hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles ached. My heart was hammering, but I couldn't let myself think too hard about what was happening. The man groaned, his head tilting toward the window. His words were slurred, mumbled. Couldn't make them out. I pushed the truck faster. I wasn't good with blood. Never had been. Even small cuts made my stomach twist. But now there was no room for that. No time to think about the warmth soaking into the seat, the way it dripped onto the floor mats. My fiancé kept pressure on the wound, kept talking to him, though I barely registered the words. The road stretched on forever. The dashboard clock barely moved, each second stretching into an eternity. Then finally, lights. A dull glow in the distance. The hospital. I swerved into the parking lot, barely braking before throwing the truck into park. The moment the doors opened, the man slumped, his weight shifting. The floor mat beneath him was soaked, dark and sticky. The emergency room doors burst open as staff ran toward us. Hands pulled him from the truck, voices shouting orders, the world tilting sideways. I just stood there, my breath coming in sharp gasps, my hands slick on the steering wheel. Then, as the last of the staff rushed inside, the doors swinging closed behind them, I realized my legs were shaking. My stomach rolled, a wave of nausea hitting me hard. I barely made it to the bushes before I threw up. Minutes blurred together. My fiancé's hand found my back, grounding me. Eventually, we sat on the curb, waiting. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. An hour passed, maybe more. Then someone came out, telling us he would be okay. 18 stitches. That was all it took to fix something that had almost killed him. If we hadn't been there, if we had waited for an ambulance, he would have bled out. We drove back to camp in silence. The fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across our tent. The grill was still open, the half-cooked burgers untouched. We tried to salvage the night, sitting by the embers, staring at the flames. It didn't feel the same. At 10:30 p.m., the sound of footsteps on gravel made us both tense. It was him, limping but alive. He looked at us, nodded. No words were needed. We had saved his life, and neither of us would ever forget it. I was heading east on I-15, just outside of Las Vegas, pushing through the quietest hours of the night. The clock on my dash read 3:02 a.m. The desert stretched out in every direction, dark and empty, with nothing but low hills and scattered shrubs breaking up the land. A full moon hung in the sky, casting just enough light to see the edges of the road without my high beams. The radio had given up miles ago, only catching bits and pieces of static, so I was driving in silence, listening to the hum of my tires on the asphalt and the steady rumble of my engine. I had been following 3 black SUVs for the past hour. They weren't speeding or doing anything erratic, just cruising along at a steady pace, a few car lengths apart, like they were moving together. What caught my eye at first were their plates. Nevada tags, but not normal ones. Just single-digit numbers in sequence, 1, 2, 3. That wasn't something you saw every day. I'm not one to get nosy about other drivers on the road. People drive all sorts of weird cars at night, and I've learned not to overthink it. But something about these SUVs bugged me. They looked identical, blacked-out windows, no visible markings, nothing to say if they were government, private security, or something else entirely. And they weren't passing or slowing down, just keeping their steady pace like they were in no hurry. I kept my distance, staying back but not far enough to lose sight of them. Around 3:20, without any warning, all 3 SUVs flicked their turn signals on at the exact same time. I didn't see a sign for an exit. There were no streetlights, no markers, not even a worn path in the dirt, just open desert. But they turned anyway, right off the highway, onto what looked like nothing more than loose gravel and sand. And then, as soon as they were off the road, their lights shut off completely. One second they were there, and the next just black shapes in the desert swallowed by the night. I felt my stomach tighten. There was nothing out there. No buildings, no power lines, no sign of a ranch or a business. Just dirt and silence. And yet, those SUVs had turned like they knew exactly where they were going. I kept driving. I told myself I didn't care what they were doing. The desert was full of weird stuff. Military installations, private airstrips, even secretive rich guys who bought up land to do God knows what in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't my problem. I was just a trucker hauling freight, trying to get to my next stop without trouble. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to. I checked my mirrors every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights appear behind me again. Nothing, just darkness. The further I got from that turnoff, the more the back of my neck itched. About 15 minutes later, I spotted a rest stop sign. I wasn't tired, but I wanted to pull over for a minute, stretch my legs, maybe splash some cold water on my face. The turnoff was a half-mile ahead. I flipped my signal on and eased off the highway. The rest stop was empty. A couple of vending machines sat near the entrance, buzzing under yellowed fluorescent lights. There was a single sedan parked near the bathrooms, but I didn't see anyone around. I climbed down from my cab, stretching my arms and rolling my shoulders. The air was still warm, even this late at night. I leaned against my truck and looked out over the highway, half expecting to see those SUVs again in the distance. But the road was empty. I let out a breath and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was making too much of it. Maybe it was nothing. I decided to grab a drink from the vending machine. I walked over, dug a couple of quarters out of my pocket, and pressed the button for a bottle of water. The machine whirred, the bottle dropped, and I bent down to grab it. And that's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't mine. A few feet away, leading from the edge of the rest stop toward the vending machines, were fresh boot prints in the dust. The kind left by thick-soled military or tactical boots. I stood up slowly and looked around. The rest stop was dead silent. No wind.
No rustling bushes.
Nothing. The footprints were deep, like whoever made them had been walking with purpose. But they stopped near the vending machine, like someone had stood there, watching. I felt a tightness in my chest. I glanced back at my truck, suddenly aware of how exposed I was standing out in the open. I turned quickly and walked back, climbing into the cab and locking the door behind me. I sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, listening to my own breathing. Then I checked my mirrors again. Nothing. I reached down, put the truck in gear, and pulled out of the rest stop, getting back onto the highway as fast as I could. For the next hour, I kept checking my mirrors, watching the road behind me. But I never saw those SUVs again. By the time the sun started creeping up over the horizon, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. But when I stopped for fuel later that morning, I got out and checked the dust on my truck. There were more footprints, right by my driver's side door. That was the last time I ever stopped along that stretch of highway at night. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. A feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything, a raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap, closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening, my ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down, and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape, person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway, just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options: make noise, stay quiet. Then the zipper moved, not fast, slow, testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps, walking away, slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading from the treeline. Stopping right at my tent. Then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. I had been camping solo for years, ever since I was in my early 20s. Something about being out in the wilderness, away from the constant hum of civilization, made me feel grounded. It wasn't about adventure or pushing my limits. I just liked the quiet, the long stretches of silence, the smell of pine and damp earth, the distant sound of running water from a stream or lake. That year, I decided to camp out in a remote part of Montana. It wasn't an official campground, just a spot I found on a topographic map. A clearing by a lake, miles away from the nearest road, nestled between rolling hills and thick forest. It looked perfect. No tourists, no RVs, no campfire smoke from families roasting marshmallows. Just me, my tent, and the wild. The drive took most of the day. I parked my truck on the side of an old service road, unloaded my gear, and started hiking in. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like an old animal path that had been reclaimed by the forest. I had my GPS, a compass, and a paper map, so I wasn't worried about getting lost. I'd done this plenty of times before. By late afternoon, I reached the spot. It was even better than I expected. A flat patch of ground near the lake, shaded by tall pines. The water was calm, barely rippling, reflecting the pale blue sky above. No signs of other campers, no trash, no broken branches from someone setting up before me. It felt untouched. I set up camp the way I always did, tent first, then the fire pit. I collected some dry wood, stacked it neatly, and made sure I had enough for the night. Once that was done, I sat by the lake and ate a quick dinner. The sun was starting to dip behind the hills, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air cooled the way it does in the mountains, and I pulled on a jacket. As the light faded, I started a small fire. I wasn't the type to sit around it telling stories or getting lost in thought. I just liked the warmth, the way it kept the night from creeping in too close. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Normal sounds, squirrels, maybe a deer moving through the trees. Nothing that put me on edge. But as I sat there, something started to nag at me. A feeling, the kind you can't explain. The kind that settles in your gut and makes your skin prickle, like being watched. I'd had it before on other trips, but it always passed. Usually it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the darkness, the way the trees seemed to press in when you were alone. I shook it off and focused on the fire. It wasn't like I was in bear country, at least not heavily. I'd taken precautions, kept my food sealed tight, and hung anything with a scent far from my tent. If anything was out there, it wasn't after me. The feeling didn't go away, though. At some point, I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot, not far off, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the woods. I looked up, firelight flickering against the trees. Could have been anything. A raccoon, a fox, even a bird landing on a dead limb. But then there was another snap. Closer this time. I stood up, scanning the dark. My flashlight was in the tent, but I didn't want to go fumbling for it. Instead, I grabbed a stick from the fire and lifted it, letting the glow stretch further into the trees. The underbrush was thick, shadows shifting with the light. Nothing moved. I waited, listening. My ears strained against the quiet, but the forest had gone still. Not even the insects were making noise anymore. After a minute, I lowered the stick and tossed it back into the fire. I told myself it was just an animal passing through, probably spooked by the fire, stopping to watch me the way animals sometimes do. Still, the feeling lingered. I let the fire burn down to embers before climbing into my tent. Zipped up the flap, laid down and listened. The silence was heavy, but I forced myself to relax. At some point, I fell asleep. I woke up to something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the faintest sound of movement. A shuffling, slow, deliberate, right outside. I didn't move. My first thought was a bear. But bears don't move like that. They don't creep. They don't hesitate. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it at the tent wall. A shadow moved, not an animal shape. Person. I shot up, heart hammering. I wasn't armed, not with a gun anyway. Just a knife in my pack. My mind raced through options. Make noise? Stay quiet? Then the zipper moved. Not fast. Slow. Testing. I lunged forward and slapped my hand against it, shoving it back down. My pulse was a drum in my ears. Silence. Then footsteps. Walking away. Slow, unhurried. I waited until they faded completely. Then I unzipped the tent, just enough to peek out. The fire was still smoldering, casting a dull glow. The trees stood silent. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The first light I packed up. Fast. Didn't bother with breakfast, didn't take my time. My hands were shaking as I shoved everything into my pack. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something. Footprints. Not boots. Bare feet. Leading from the treeline. Stopping right at my tent. Then turning back. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I hiked out faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't look back until I was on the road, miles away. I never reported it. What would I even say? But I never camped alone again. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry stream bed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter, built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead something moved, a shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped, not when my legs burned, not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose, until I saw my truck in the distance, until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. I didn't go to the cabin looking for trouble. I went because I needed a break. My life had been grinding me down for months, the stress piling up so high that I felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. My job had turned into an endless cycle of deadlines and expectations I could never meet. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't eating right. I felt like I was unraveling piece by piece, and I knew if I didn't step away for a while, I was going to fall apart. The cabin seemed like the perfect place to reset. I found it online, buried deep in the back pages of a rental site. It wasn't one of those polished vacation homes with a hot tub and a lake view. This was something different, remote, isolated, a true escape. No electricity, no plumbing, no cell service. Just a one-room structure deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. That was exactly what I needed. I booked it for a full week without thinking twice. That was my first mistake. The drive took almost 10 hours. I left early in the morning, only stopping once for gas before turning onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. The road was worse than I expected. Uneven, covered in deep ruts and loose rocks. The trees pressed in on both sides, thick and tangled, their branches stretching overhead and blocking out most of the sky. It felt like I was heading into a different world, one completely separate from everything I knew. After almost an hour, I reached the spot where I had to leave my truck behind. The cabin was another 4 miles in, only accessible by foot. I stepped out and stretched, rolling my shoulders. The air was crisp, fresh in a way that city air never was. The only sound was the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere deep in the trees. I grabbed my pack from the truck bed, double-checked my gear, and started walking. The trail wasn't well marked. It was barely more than a thin strip of dirt winding through the trees, overgrown in some places, littered with fallen branches and thick with roots that made each step tricky. I kept my pace steady, focusing on the ground in front of me, the weight of my pack pressing into my shoulders. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint, creeping unease that settled in my gut. The forest was too quiet. Normally, you'd hear birds, insects, the distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. But here there was nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the cabin. I spotted it through the trees just as the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a small porch, and a single window. The wood was weathered, darkened with age, but it looked solid. There was a pile of firewood stacked neatly beside the door, an old metal chair sitting on the porch. I stepped onto the porch and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cool and stale, the scent of dust and old wood thick in the small space. The cabin was just one room, a cot against the far wall, a small table with a wooden chair, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a few shelves filled with supplies. Canned food, matches, an old lantern. I set my pack down and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. The first night, I sat on the porch and watched the stars come out. The darkness here was absolute. No distant glow of city lights. No noise except for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I tried to ignore it. I went inside, bolted the door, and climbed into my sleeping bag. But I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I woke early, my back stiff from the thin mattress. I made coffee over the small propane stove I had brought and stepped outside to drink it. The forest was bathed in pale morning light, the air cool against my skin. I decided to explore. I followed a narrow trail that led deeper into the woods, winding between the trees. The ground was uneven, covered in thick layers of fallen leaves. About a mile in, I found something strange. Clearing. At first, it seemed normal. just an open space surrounded by trees. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something. The ground had been disturbed. There were patches of dirt that had been dug up, shallow holes scattered throughout the clearing. Some of them looked recent, the soil loose, the edges sharp. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Why would someone be digging out here? I looked around, suddenly feeling exposed. The trees loomed around me, dark and silent. I turned and headed back to the cabin, walking faster than before. That night, I couldn't relax. I sat inside with the lantern burning low, listening. The woods outside were silent, too silent. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving around the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I sat completely still, heart pounding. Minutes passed. Then, finally, I heard movement again. The footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all. To first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't going to stay another night. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then I saw it. Near the edge of the clearing, where the trail led back to my truck. Fresh footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Someone had been out here, watching. I tightened the straps on my pack and started walking. Fast. The whole way back, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone following. But the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed inside, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't stop. I never went back. I had always preferred hiking alone. There was something about being out there, deep in the woods with no one around, that made me feel like I had stepped outside of the world for a while. I liked the silence, the feeling of being totally untethered from the rest of my life.
No sedulis, no conversations, no expectations.
Just me, the trail, and the sound of my own footsteps. That's how I ended up hiking a remote trail in Montana late one afternoon, pushing further into the wilderness than I probably should have. I had been on a road trip for a few weeks, moving through the northern states, camping out when I could, staying in cheap motels when I couldn't. I had spent most of my time on well-traveled trails, places where I could pass other hikers every so often and feel like I wasn't completely alone. But that morning, I had stopped at a small gas station on the edge of a town I barely remember the name of, and the guy behind the counter told me about a trail a few miles out. No one really goes up that way, he had said. Not because it's dangerous, just kind of out of the way. That was exactly what I wanted to hear. So I drove out there, found the unmarked dirt lot he had mentioned, and set off into the woods with my pack strapped tight to my shoulders. It was perfect at first. The trail was well maintained but clearly not heavily used. The trees were thick, towering overhead, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I could hear birds, the distant rush of a stream somewhere off to the right. Felt like I had stepped into another world. I should have turned back before it got dark. I had planned to hike out about 4 miles, then loop back before the sun set. But the trail was beautiful, and I kept pushing forward, telling myself I would turn around just after the next bend, then just after the next clearing. Before I knew it, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, and I was farther from my car than I had meant to be. I wasn't worried yet. I had my flashlight, extra water, and a small knife clipped to my belt. I had hiked alone plenty of times before, even in low light. I knew what I was doing. At least I thought I did. I was about 2 miles from my car when I first noticed the silence. Not just quiet, the total suffocating absence of sound. The birds had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant rush of the stream was gone. I stopped walking. The woods felt heavy, like they were pressing in around me. I held my breath, listening hard, trying to pick up anything. An insect buzzing, a branch creaking, my own heartbeat. Nothing. That was the first time I felt it. That slow, creeping awareness that something wasn't right. I turned my flashlight on, sweeping the beam across the trees. Everything looked the same as it had before. Just woods, just the trail, just me. But the silence lingered. I started walking again, a little faster now, my boots crunching against the dirt. It was the only sound in the world. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the forest came back to life. A bird chirped. A breeze rustled the leaves. The distant stream was there again, whispering through the trees. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just my imagination, I told myself. Just my mind playing tricks on me. But I picked up my pace anyway. About a mile from my car, I saw the first footprint. It was right there in the dirt, just off the side of the trail. Deep, clear, recent. It wasn't mine. I stopped, shining my flashlight over it, my stomach twisting. It was a boot print, same as mine, but bigger, wider, and it was pointing perpendicular to the trail, as if someone had stepped out of the woods, paused, then stepped back in. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. I kept walking. The second footprint was even fresher. This one was right in the middle of the trail. My throat went dry. I hadn't seen anyone else out here. No one had passed me. No one should have been this deep in the woods at this hour. I swept my flashlight along the ground, looking for more prints. There were none. Just that single boot print pressed firm into the dirt. I took a step back, my body tense. My heart was beating too fast now. Then I heard it, the snap of a branch, somewhere off to my left. I swung my flashlight in that direction, my pulse hammering. The trees stood still, thick and unmoving. I waited, ears straining. Nothing. After a long moment, I forced myself to keep moving, my legs stiff, my breath tight in my chest. I was almost to the car. I just needed to get there. The last stretch of trail felt endless. I kept my flashlight low, sweeping the beam along the ground, watching for more footprints, for movement, for anything. The silence had returned, thick and absolute. Then, finally, I saw it, the dark shape of my car sitting in the dirt lot up ahead. Relief flooded me. I was almost there. And then, just as I stepped off the trail, I caught one last thing in the flashlight beam. Another boot print. This one was different. It was facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't look around. I walked straight to my car, yanked the door open, and got inside, locking the doors the second I was in. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, my headlights flooding the empty lot. Empty. But I didn't wait. I pulled out fast, my tires kicking up dust, my eyes fixed on the road ahead. I didn't breathe properly until I was miles away. I don't know what happened out there. I don't know who made those footprints. Maybe it was just another hiker, though that seems unlikely. No one parks at that trailhead. No one hikes out there. It's too isolated, too empty. I keep thinking about that last footprint, the one facing mine, like someone had been standing there, waiting, and I wonder how long had they been out there, and how close had they gotten without me knowing. I didn't go to the cabin to scare myself. I went because I needed to be alone. For the last year, I'd been drowning in stress. My job, my personal life, everything felt like it was closing in on me. I was always tired but could never sleep. Even when I did, my mind kept racing. I couldn't remember the last time I felt truly at peace. So I decided to get away. I rented the cabin online. It wasn't a tourist spot or some cozy vacation rental with a lake view. It was a real cabin. Deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, with no electricity, no running water, and no cell service. That was exactly what I wanted. I booked it for a week. That was my first mistake. The drive took longer than expected. I left early, stopping once for gas and a few last-minute supplies before turning onto the dirt road that led to the cabin. The road was rough, full of potholes and deep grooves that made the truck rattle. The trees pressed in from both sides, thick and tangled, blocking most of the sky. It felt like I was heading somewhere I wasn't supposed to go. After an hour of slow, careful driving, I reached the point where the road ended. From there, it was another 4 miles on foot. I parked, grabbed my pack, and started walking. The trail was barely visible, just a thin path through the trees, overgrown and uneven. I moved carefully, stepping over roots, pushing past low-hanging branches. The air was cool, and the only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Something about the silence unsettled me. I tried to ignore it. After nearly 2 hours, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a tiny porch, and a single window. The wood was dark and weathered, the porch sagging slightly. An old metal chair sat near the door, rusted at the edges. The place looked abandoned. I stepped onto the porch and pushed the door open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and the faint scent of old wood. The cabin was just one room. A cot against the far wall, a small table with a wooden chair, a cast-iron stove in the corner, and a few shelves filled with supplies. Canned food, matches, an old lantern. I dropped my pack and exhaled. This was exactly what I needed. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. The silence was heavier inside, but I tried to focus on the good.
No emails.
No phone calls, just me and the woods. As the sun dipped lower, I went outside to gather firewood. The forest was dense, the trees packed tightly together. I walked a few hundred yards, picking up dry branches, loading my arms until I had enough. As I turned back toward the cabin, something caught my eye. Path. It was barely more than a break in the undergrowth, winding deeper into the trees. I hadn't seen it before. For some reason, it made me uneasy. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I turned and walked back to the cabin. That night, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't the unfamiliar bed or the sounds of the forest. It was something else. The feeling, like I wasn't alone. I lay there in the dark, listening. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A sound outside. A slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dead leaves. I went still, barely breathing. The steps moved around the cabin. Slow, steady. Then they stopped, right outside the door. I didn't move. Minutes passed. Then, finally, the footsteps retreated. I lay awake until morning. At first light, I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed.
No footprints.
Had I imagined it? I forced myself to shake the feeling away and focus on the day. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, then decided to explore. I followed the narrow trail behind the cabin, moving deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the air cooler. Then I found it. The clearing. It was a small, open space, ringed by trees. First, it looked ordinary, but as I stepped closer, I noticed something. The ground had been disturbed. Patches of dirt were dug up, shallow holes scattered across the clearing. Some of them looked fresh, the soil loose, dark. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here, recently, digging. I turned and walked back to the cabin. Faster this time. That night, I locked the door. I sat by the stove, listening. The forest was silent. Too silent. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Moving around the cabin. I gripped the knife in my hand. Every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A long pause. Then something pressed against the wood. A slow scraping sound, like nails dragging across the surface. I stayed completely still. Then, just as slowly as they had come, the footsteps retreated. I didn't sleep. The first light, I packed my gear. I wasn't staying another night. I stepped outside, scanning the trees. Nothing. Then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt. Not mine. Someone had been standing outside the cabin, watching. I tightened my pack straps and started walking. Fast. The whole way back, I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and climbed inside, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I turned onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood at the edge of the trees, watching. I didn't stop. I never went back. I had planned the trip for weeks. The idea was simple: 3 nights alone in the deep woods, away from people, away from noise, away from everything. I wasn't new to camping. I had done solo trips before, sometimes for just a night, sometimes for a full week. But this time I wanted to go deeper. I wanted real solitude, real wilderness. I studied the maps, picked a spot deep inside a national forest, far from any roads, and packed everything I needed. No phone, no GPS, just a compass, a paper map, and enough supplies to last me until I hiked back. The first day was easy. I parked my truck at the trailhead, locked it up, and started hiking. The woods here were thick, endless trees stretching in every direction. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The sun filtered through the canopy in patches, leaving long shadows that moved as the wind rustled the leaves. I followed a narrow, unmarked trail that wound through hills and valleys, past dry creek beds and moss-covered rocks. It wasn't a path most people used. That was the point. I didn't want to run into anyone. By mid-afternoon, I found a good spot to set up camp, a small clearing beside a slow-moving stream. The water was clear, running over smooth stones, shallow but enough to filter and drink. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and sat by the water for a while, just listening to the forest. The sounds of the woods were familiar: birds chirping, insects buzzing, the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that noise was a good thing. Silence was what you didn't want. That first night, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal for my pack. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the trees. The air grew cooler as the sun dipped below the treetops. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the dark, enjoying the quiet. At some point, I started feeling uneasy. It wasn't anything obvious, just a vague sense that something was off. The fire crackled. The woods whispered with the wind, but underneath it all, there was something else, a feeling more than a sound. I told myself I was imagining it. I had been alone in the woods plenty of times before. The mind plays tricks when there's nothing but darkness around you. I forced myself to ignore it and went to bed. I didn't sleep well. I woke up more than once, staring at the ceiling of my tent, listening. The woods weren't silent, but the sounds felt wrong, like they weren't coming from where they should be, like something was moving, circling, just outside the range of my fire, but I never heard anything close. Just the occasional snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves. Could have been anything: a deer, a raccoon, some small animal moving through the brush. I convinced myself of that and fell back asleep. The next morning, I shook off the unease and packed up. I wanted to hike deeper before setting up my second camp. The plan was to make a loop, covering about 15 miles over 3 days, then circling back to my truck. I walked for hours, pushing through thick brush, following the terrain as it sloped downward into a valley. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. The trees were older here, their trunks thick, their roots gnarled and tangled. The undergrowth was untouched, no signs of people passing through. By midday, I came across something strange. A tree with deep, parallel scratches running down its bark. The cuts were fresh, the exposed wood still pale. They were too high up to be from a small animal. Too clean to be natural. A bear, I told myself. Had to be. I moved on, keeping an eye out for more signs of wildlife. I wasn't scared, but I was more aware now, more careful. I tightened the straps on my pack and adjusted the bear spray on my belt, just in case. A few miles later, I found another strange thing. A pile of bones at the base of a tree. Small, clean, picked dry. Probably a rabbit or something similar. But there were a lot of them. More than I would expect. Again, I told myself it was nothing. Nature is messy.
Predators Hand, Animals die.
That's just how it is. Still, I moved faster. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing that seemed like a good place to set up camp. I was exhausted from hiking all day, and I didn't want to push further into the woods without enough daylight left. The clearing was small, surrounded by thick trees, with just enough space for my tent and a fire. As I set up camp, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Another footprint. It was large, larger than my own boot print. But that wasn't what made me uneasy. It was the shape. The front half was normal, but the back half dragged, as if whatever left it had been limping or pulling something behind it. I stared at it for a long time, my stomach twisting. There was no way a bear made that. No way it was an animal at all. I looked around the clearing, scanning the trees, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds. I told myself it was old, maybe distorted by the rain, by the way the ground settled. I had no better explanation. That night, I didn't light a fire. I sat in the dark, back against a tree, listening. Every sound made my pulse jump. The wind felt colder. The shadows stretched further. At some point, I heard it. Not close, but not far. A slow, shuffling movement through the brush. The same dragging step. I held my breath, gripping the knife in my lap. The sound moved past my camp, just beyond the tree line, never stopping, never hesitating. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed up and started hiking back the way I came. I wasn't going to finish the loop. I wasn't going deeper. I just wanted out. I walked fast, covering miles without stopping. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, scanning the trees. I didn't see anything, but I felt it. By midday, I reached the stream where I had camped the first night. My original trail wasn't far now. Just a few more miles, and I'd be back at my truck. Then I saw it. Something had disturbed the ground near the water. Rocks overturned, dirt churned up, and there, in the mud, was another footprint. Fresh, still damp. I didn't stop. I hiked until my legs burned, until my lungs ached, until the trees began to thin and I saw the clearing where I had parked. The sight of my truck nearly made me collapse with relief. I unlocked the door, threw my pack inside, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the highway, until the forest was nothing but a dark blur in my rearview mirror. I still don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. But I know one thing, whatever it wasn't lost. It was following me, and it let me go. This time.